The Force was kind of there with this one.
We have a mission for you. A major weapons test is imminent. We need to know what it is and how to destroy it.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
What will you do when they catch you? What will you do if they break you? If you continue to fight? What will you become?
So hey guys, and welcome to Owen's Sound. We still have a lot of film reviews to do for the remainder of the films that came out in 2016, especially with how crammed December is. And today we're going to be talking about the new Star Wars story, Rogue One. This is of course the new story movie in the Star Wars universe, happening between episodes 3 and up to the moment before episode 4. And the movie follows the team that followed that quick little one-off line in episode 4 of the team that got us the Death Star plans. And this is the story behind them. The movie is directed by Gareth Edwards, whom some of you may remember from 2014's Godzilla, which had one really cool scene, the Stanley Kubrick-esque helo drop sequence, and his much stronger movie Monsters, which apparently was referenced by the crew in the design of some of the creatures in the background of this movie. So let's go to the ups and downs of the cast behind this movie. Felicity Jones stars as Jyn Erso, and I thought she gave an okay performance. I was much more interested in her kind of more rebellious character, especially considering she's playing a rebel in this movie, before the actual movie itself, as the trailers were very misleading in terms of the tone, in terms of the, I guess, some of the elements that were going to be in this movie. But I felt like her character just wasn't given enough depth. We have her as a very young child, and then her as she is in the entire movie, and we don't even get the 20-minute sequence that we get with Luke at the start of A New Hope, which really develops enough of his character so we know where he stands in this current spot. So overall, you never just really get the sense of her sense of humor and just these different things that really make her more of a Star Wars character like you get from these characters like Rey and Finn and Poe. On the other hand, you have Mads Mikkelsen's portrayal of her father, Galen Erso, which, although we also get almost no screen time from him, you do feel the conflict that he feels having to work for the Empire but wanting to do something as he doesn't want to work for them. And this kind of gives his character a slightly more conflict, and it actually drives certain decisions that actually ripple throughout the Star Wars continuum in terms of the timeline. And his character was interesting, even though we really don't get much of it on screen. Diego Luna is pretty useless in this movie, doesn't do anything super important, is really just there to give somebody for Jyn to talk to in a lot of the different scenes. Forrest Whitaker's character really just shows up at certain points when the plot needs him, and really just disappears in the most confusing of ways. Ben Mendelsohn's director Krennic is very not menacing or anything like that. He's very almost cartoonish in the way that he's constantly shot down by his superiors, almost aggressively in certain points. And the way he just keeps failing in certain plots throughout the movie is just almost hilarious, even though he is probably one of the most influential people on the entire ripples going into episode 4 and the Death Stars overall. But the movie really doesn't make you feel this way. Donnie Yen's Chirrut is actually one of the characters you get the most emotional attachment to in the movie. He works very well with Jiang Wen's Baze, who is this kind of, I guess, hired assassin character who is joked a lot of times throughout the movie as he doesn't need luck, or really doesn't even need the Force overall, because he has Baze to look after him. These characters have probably the most fun dynamic in the entire movie, to be honest, and you really feel for them when certain things are happening throughout the movie, and you can feel the chemistry between them as they are the most Star Wars characters in the entire movie. Also, Alan Tudyk's K2SO is really fun, although I do feel like, given the strengths that he has as kind of this robot that's both quippy and useful for technical things, is also able to do some stuff in combat, the robot overall, even given certain things, is just nowhere comparable to an R2-D2 C-3PO, or even a BB-8 for that matter, which I felt had more weight in physical slapstick than K2SO really has during the entire movie. So let's look at where the movie went very right. It was cool to see a bit more lore in the universe, going to some of the crystals, the Jedi Temple on Jedha, although they don't actually specifically reference it as a Jedi Temple. There are very clear references to fallen Jedi statues that they don't actually mention, they're just shown, which I thought was interesting background storytelling. And I felt this overall sense of trying to give some of the lore just visually was very interesting, and kind of giving backstory into where the Jedi Skies Have Fallen, and certain actual things like the crystals, which we really don't know that much about if you don't read any of the books, as I don't. I felt like this was a really cool way to start introducing that into the movies a little bit more. I also thought the Guardians of the Galaxy-esque introduction of the planets with the text under them, which is the first for the series, I believe, was actually very interesting, and it meant you could actually kind of follow which planets were happening rather than having these references given to you, as I just felt this wasn't something that would take away from the film's visual storytelling, but it was nice to not just be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Coruscant, I'm pretty sure this is this planet, and it was an interesting way, and I liked this continuity between Guardians and these movies. Visually, this is one of the most beautiful Star Wars movies ever, and I really think next to The Force Awakens, it probably is on par with it. It was really cool to see some of these classic Star Wars elements, including some of the vehicles, in terms of these interesting new locations like the beach, and it was interesting in this way that the visuals were really almost seemed to be driving the movie more than anything else. There's some also really great integration of some old clips from the older movies that they actually integrate into this movies almost seamlessly in these really interesting ways that make it feel like you're getting this continuity from this one to episode 4 and onwards. There are also some really great battle sequences that don't feel like this overtly, let's just have the lightsabers battling like super cool and not actually have any weight behind them like they did in some of the older movies, but there are some really cool space battles where you're actually understanding the dynamic between why they're doing these things, and there's actual weight given to people talking between them in certain scenes where there are other scenes where people are just doing cool stuff, but it's not having any weight to it. Something that Disney, with both their Marvel and the latest Star Wars movie, did really well also with this one is the pacing. This movie is about 2 hours long, and I didn't even notice the time going by. It just flew by this entire movie, and I just felt like the pacing was one of the few things in this movie that worked really well, and really, to be perfectly honest, the things that I'm about to mention with this movie didn't even spring up in my mind until after I was done watching and was thinking about it for days and days on end, trying to think about what I liked and disliked about this movie. So here's what I noticed when I started thinking about it. So there's really no backstory to any characters or anything going on in the entire movie. The entire movie is very dependent on you knowing the Star Wars story, but really just feels like the characters themselves and what's going on with them is so secondary, and it really makes us feel like it's not like the standalone movie, and you really don't connect to the characters as much as you should, especially considering the events and the ways that they want you to feel for these characters later on. As mentioned before, the 20 minutes of quote-unquote boring stuff that they give Luke at the start of A New Hope is probably actually in retrospect more interesting than anything that goes on in the start of this movie to give you kind of backstory to these characters, despite a couple scenes that were kind of interesting and were kind of interesting intros to these characters. That kind of set up giving somebody their context in their everyday life going into this movie would have been really helpful and really given us a little more introspect into the characters that we're watching. As I was kind of mentioning before, there's action in this movie, but there's very little talking and there's very little character with these action sequences, and it feels like even with the grand space battles and some of the fights near the end of the movie, you don't really feel much or feel any exhilaration or fear going into these fights, as you either feel like the heroes are invincible or you don't really care what happens to them because you haven't grown enough emotional attachment to some of the characters, including some of them that only have like a couple lines and are really only there for plot convenience. As there are a ridiculous amount of characters in this movie, it feels like there were just too many and they just couldn't focus on a couple. Despite the mention of lore, the movie actually forgets to focus on certain things that make this movie actually stand out as its own movie. And I really felt like this movie is a complete dependent on the Star Wars movies as a whole. I mean, this does feel obvious, but I feel like even something like Episode 7 you could watch on its own and then watch the other movies and get more out of it on repeat viewings, but this one is so seemingly dependent on the other movies that you couldn't just watch this one without watching them, and I felt like this actually weakened the movie overall. So fair warning, it's going to be spoilers until I'm giving my score at the end of the video. So one of the things I did think was kind of interesting in terms of the way that they ended the movie was the decision to end with getting rid of and killing off all the characters at the end. This is really kind of a bold move, especially for something coming out of Disney, especially right now. Although if you do listen to the original line of dialogue in episode 4, they did say that they paid for the plans with their lives, although this could be, you know, totally turn around and say like, oh, a couple characters got away, we just assume they're all dead, they might have, you know, gone on vacation or something like this. But it was kind of refreshing in a weird way to see them go with this new kind of scorched earth policy and just be like, yes, this is a standalone story and these characters did pay for this whole thing with their lives. Unfortunately though, many of the characters were killed off haphazardly or almost incidentally in a way that you wouldn't really have felt anything for them. I know most of the characters, as they were killed off. Several of them throughout the final 20 minutes of the movie seemed to just be killed off because they were wrapping up the movie and they needed to kill the characters off. It to me almost just felt kind of wasteful. It felt kind of insensitive to characters. It made it so they didn't have any connection to them by the end of the movie, and I just felt like these deaths were just kind of like them being like, okay, kill this character off, kill this character off. It just didn't feel right, and it didn't feel like it had enough weight, so it just felt like, why is this scene happening? You could have just had the whole thing happen when the Death Star blows up the planet. There is some weight to some of the deaths at the end of the movie. I did feel a couple tears starting to well up for one or two characters, but I just felt overall that just given the way that so many of the characters were taken out and just the overall way that these scenes were executed, it still didn't feel right, even with the characters that I did feel some emotion for and didn't want to see go. I think it was refreshing to see Jyn and Cassian's ending of their relationship in the entire movie actually was more one of friendship than a romantic involvement. I felt that the hand-holding at the end of the movie, given the way that it was framed, seemed to be them kind of reconciling their differences and kind of coming together and like, this, we accomplished something, we did something meaningful, and they were holding hands as, you know, two people facing the end of the world in their case would be looking like. And I felt this was kind of refreshing, as so many of these movies seem to try and force some sort of romantic angle, even with Daisy Ridley's character and John Boyega's character in The Force Awakens. I felt like there was seemingly some sort of romance that was brewing there, and I felt like this one they tried to hint at it, but this one very precisely ended on this one of friendship and camaraderie, which notably there should have been a lot more of in the movie, as only a couple characters have this sense either pre-built in, and this is the only one that really feels built over the entire movie and solidified. Also, the heaviest of spoilers on the Tarkin and Leia faces in this movie. I felt this was very weird and not really necessary for the movie. I also found it slightly tasteless, as I did see this on the day that Carrie Fisher died, of course, R.I.P. Carrie Fisher. But I just felt like this was weird, and I didn't feel it was necessary. You could have had one of these behind the head shots, or just really not reference the character as heavily as they did just showing their face. As I felt like, you know, you didn't need to do this thing where you kind of show the character but don't, and it's almost corny. But I just felt like this way was almost weird, as either the actor in the time that they shot it was dead or too old to appear, and I just felt it took away, and it made the scenes focus too much on this, as you're like, oh, that looks like a weird face and I know that's not that person. I also just felt like having these characters come in, especially something like Darth Vader as well, on top of that, just made it feel like the characters in the movie weren't really getting their own movie. It just added more to the, this isn't a standalone feature, and I just felt like overall this movie didn't feel with these characters like it was the character's own film. And I just felt like these scenes were all unnecessary. They didn't add anything to the movie specifically, but they just made it feel like the directors didn't have enough belief and wanted to put more effort into the movie that they were making to have these characters be something iconic that you might want to reference in a future movie. Also, I very much saw the entire Vader sequence as a cash-in, and especially the scene that he shows up in at the very end of the movie was framed so strangely. It almost seemed like kind of this glory kind of fight to the death sequence that was almost shot kind of either like he was the kind of hero in the sequence, or it was almost comic in certain ways that it was framed, and just how fast that it happened. But I just felt like this was, in the entire reference to the movie, probably one of the saddest and most brutal death sequences of the entire movie, and wasn't shot or portrayed this way. So despite a lot of the shortcomings, given the great pacing, some of the visual style, I want to say this movie's about a 7 for me. I always love everything Star Wars, but I just felt like overall this movie just is not going to work well for me on repeat viewings, despite some of the technical standouts of this movie. A lot of the technical feats, including the visuals and certain things like that, really work in this movie. I just feel like a lot of these story elements and the characters are just going to make this movie get worse and worse the more I watch it, and I'll just be looking for the background elements a lot more going forward. So I really want to land this one right on a crisp 7. I feel like it probably will sink more and more the more I watch it, especially considering that a lot of my feelings in this respect didn't show up until I thought about the movie going after, and some of the weak points and strong points were given certain perspectives of the movie, and I feel like repeat viewings may change the score of this movie for the worse, but I do feel like at this point I do think the 7 is right. So as always guys, you can check out everything I'm doing on my Owen Sound blog, and you'll be able to hear the audio full steam ahead review of this on the Real Deal podcast. I'm sure my friend Michael will have a lot to say about this one. He's a big Star Wars fan, so I'm sure he will have more to say on this than I will, although I will probably be a bigger voice of dissension on this one than he will. So you can check that out on soundcloud.com/real_deal. And to end this one, I wanted to ask you guys, what is your favorite Star Wars movie?